My name is Doug Irwin. I'm a professor in the economics department and co-director of the Political Economy Project. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this event on a beautiful day. Just two upcoming events that I want to draw your attention to. One is this Wednesday in Rocky One, this room right here. We're going to have Tony Banout of the University of Chicago on free inquiry and free expression on campus. He is the author of a recent book on the Chicago approach to free expression and campus life, and he'll be here to discuss what they're doing at the University of Chicago and how it applies more broadly to other institutions around the U.S. and the world. On Thursday, another Rocky event we're having as part of the 100-day speaker series, the question, are tariffs good for America? We're going to have Dominic Pino of National Review and Stephen Vaughn of King & Spalding, both heavily written extensively or actively and participate in trade policy debates. That will be at 4:30 in Filene this Thursday. And so that will be an interesting event regarding what the Trump administration is up to in terms of trade. In terms of this afternoon's event, we're absolutely delighted to welcome back to campus Daniel D. Martino. He is working on an economics Ph.D. at Columbia University. He's a fellow of the Manhattan Institute, and he is going to speak to us about the high price of free things, his experience on life in Venezuela, and what we can learn from the experience. And let me just say that one of the classes that many of you are taking right now, Econ 39, we're asking the question, what is behind the wealth of nations? And we've asked that Adam Smith question, why are some countries rich and some countries poor? And we talk about some of the factors that drive economic growth or prosperity. Well, it's also important to examine cases in which there's a loss of wealth of nations, in which case countries sort of implode economically with tragic humanitarian consequences and broader consequences for the region. So Daniel will speak and then entertain questions. Let's give him a Dartmouth welcome to campus. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. I don't know if you can take pictures too. By the way, I highly recommend that event with Dominic Pino on the 15th. I know Dominic for several years, and he's a great economic commentator and speaker on this trade issue. So today I want to talk about, obviously, Venezuela and where I'm from, and socialism and the high price of free things, really how I like to title it, because nothing is really free, as you probably know if you studied any economics. And you probably have heard of Venezuela before. And when you hear the word Venezuela, you probably think of things like people lining up for food, right? In places where there's a shortage. You probably think of hyperinflation. So much inflation, meaning the rise in the price of things in the economy, that people have to carry around large packs of cash. But I want to go back to a different country, right? Back when Venezuela was not a socialist country, back when Venezuela was not a poor country, but a country that actually welcomed immigrants. And a little glimpse of that was this is the ship in which my grandfather immigrated to Venezuela in 1956, the Veracruz vessel. And I went last October to Spain with my mom. And you see, my grandparents from my mom's side went back to Spain after Venezuela was destroyed. And I went to visit. My grandpa has already passed away, but I wanted to do a Catholic pilgrimage that you might know of called El Camino, the Way of St. James in northwestern Spain. Beautiful. That's exactly the part of where my grandfather was from. He was from the city of Orense. My great-grandmother had an apartment there that the family still owns. And I went to stay at that apartment with my mom the night before we started the pilgrimage. And I was very curious about the things that my great-grandmother had, and I opened one drawer, and I found this. These are all the letters that my grandpa sent to his mother from Venezuela every single month since 1956, up until the year 2000, when he stopped sending letters, and it's like, we can't just do international calls. And my great-grandmother saved them all. I want to read you the first letter, an excerpt that I translated from that first letter. Caracas, February 20th, 1956. Dear parents and siblings, I arrived the 16th at 8 a.m. to the port of La Guaira. The first day, we went in the car at night. The great Caracas, this is the sky with many lights. Mom, I tell you again, don't feel any worry for me, because I am like I never thought I would. Food is plenty. That is what Venezuela was in 1956. Caracas had more cars per capita than the United States. I actually learned this from a book written by two American economists who traveled to Venezuela in 1953. It's incredible, and it was at the Columbia Library. And my grandpa opened a car garage. He's the one here on your right, where he washed cars and charged for parking. And to save money and send remittances back to his family in Spain, he actually, obviously this is probably illegal now, or it certainly would be illegal in the US for zoning and all those building or whatever coding regulations. He lived in the parking garage in a little apartment he built inside the garage in that door behind there, so that he didn't have to pay rent. And he sent half of his income in remittances to his mother. And I was able to verify this because in every single letter that he sent, he wrote the amount of US dollars that he sent to his mom. In fact, my great-grandmother bought that apartment because of the money that my grandpa sent her from Venezuela. And so it's really fascinating. And I grew up in a good family. I'm an only child. My parents were both born and raised in Venezuela. But I grew up in a different country. The same name, right, Venezuela. Well, really different name because the government also changed the name of the country. But everybody knows it as Venezuela. But a country where there were mass shortages of food, of really every basic item, where while I was in high school, the teacher would dismiss class because she got a text from a friend telling her that there's chicken in the grocery store next door, so I have to run and line up first. So class is dismissed, kids, I'm sorry. Why? Because she was doing what was best for her family. Totally right. I don't blame her. I would have done the same thing. Where in the country with the largest oil reserves in the world, there is no gasoline. So cars line up along the street, sometimes for over 24 hours. People sleeping in them. People who were better off pay somebody else to get it, not to get in line, do the line for them, or try to bribe some of the gas station employees to give them gasoline. And where the price of things is so low, is so high and increases so rapidly that you can't keep up with it, so you need big packs of cash. That was the country I grew up in. Increasingly that way. I was telling during lunch to some of the students that my favorite story is when we went to Burger King and there was no meat. They only had chicken. And I'm like, is this Chicken King or Burger King? What is going on here? McDonald's ran out of potatoes, so there were no French fries. And so they made fried yuca. Yuca, it's this plant from South America. Much healthier, by the way, much better, I would argue. But still, if you want your French fries, you should be able to get your French fries. This is a picture of a pack of cash I took from Venezuela with me. That was worth nothing. It was worth only about $1. And so I left, and so did my grandpa, the one that you saw earlier. That's him, 60 years after he went. He came in with 19 years old, and he left at 79 years old from Venezuela. And not only did we leave, but about 8 to 9 million people have left Venezuela. That is approximately 30% of the population of the country pre-crisis, 30%. And I want people to understand the scale. It's the largest refugee crisis in the world, what happened in Venezuela. It's much larger than Afghanistan. It's much larger than Syria. It's much larger than Ukraine. It's much larger than whatever else you have heard. In fact, if you look up through the history of international movements of refugees worldwide, there are only 4 larger refugee crises in world history in absolute numbers. Not proportions, just absolute numbers. Obviously, 2 that are larger are obvious, World War I and World War II. Makes sense. Another one is the Bangladeshi War of Independence because like 300 freaking million people live in Bangladesh, so obviously the movement is going to be more than 9 million. And there was a 4th one that I don't quite remember actually, but you can look this up. But that is how large this extent, and all of the other refugee crises throughout the world that are any larger or even comparable have been the result of violence, of wars. Venezuela's refugee crisis is the largest peacetime refugee crisis in human history. So you must think, how can a country that welcomed immigrants, that was the #1 world's exporter of oil, How can a country that is tropical, that has no problems with weather, growing food, right? This is not like, oh, there's this terrible natural disaster, this hurricane, you might think. No, no earthquake, no tsunami. How can a country go from that to the world's largest refugee crisis? Clearly, it's man-made. How can a country like that have people with jobs, with families, who are not on drugs, eating from the garbage? Like them. Because the most ethical response, if you don't have money, right, and you can't obtain it by working, is probably looking through the garbage, right? It's that or you steal. So the people who have some values go through the garbage. And this is really very simple, guys. This is a story of private property versus government property or government control. This is the story of every other socialist regime in human history. And you might say, Daniel, why do you call it socialism? Well, let's start by the fact that it's written in the streets. They tell you it's socialism. It's written in signs on the road, like this one, in big red hearts, made in socialism. That's what they say. Do you know what they promise? What's the name of their ideology? Socialism of the 21st century. What's the name of the ruling political party? The United Socialist Party of Venezuela, alongside the Communist Party, which had existed for decades. But now the communists are mad because the Socialist Party took over, and so they excommunicated them, and now no, they're not real communists. I'm the real communist. You know, the same story as always, and then they kill each other, kind of like Stalin did. Socialism is very easily defined. You might say, Daniel, socialism is not that. Socialism is simply government control, or government ownership of the means of production. Now, you can own it directly, the government owns it, or the government can control it indirectly if they tell you absolutely everything of what to do with it. Right? If you had a 100% tax on all your profits, are you the owner? No, because the 100% shareholder is the government because they had 100% of the proceeds. So that would be an indirect way also for government control. And of course, this is not about, black and white. This is about a continuum, right, of socialism versus free enterprise, and we'll get to that. But what are the policies that made Venezuela go from so rich to so poor? They're actually very clearly defined. And these are, number one, nationalizations. The government came and said, this is not your company anymore, it's mine. The military would even take it from you. There are plenty of videos, you can look this around, early in the Chavez regime, where they would have the generals coming to the Coca-Cola factory. And now they are going to distribute the Coca-Colas. They're going to take all the money, they're going to do it. It's going to be the workers in power, right? The workers are going to manage it. And it's all going to go excellent. Because you don't need the owners, right? The evil capitalists, you don't need them, right? The workers can do it all. Why don't they go and start their own company then? They can. You can. Anybody can start a company. Oh, they don't have the money? Give them the money and see how it works. No, they took over people's companies. Not only did they take them over, but what's the incentive in a social, or even in a democratic country? Let's talk about a democratic country, because Venezuela started as a democratic experiment, right? These people got elected into power. What is the incentive of a politician in a democratic country? What do politicians want? Tell me. This is an actual question. Yes? Electoral power. So they want to remain in office, right? They don't want to be voted out. So one way to do that is if you own the companies, you want to hire more workers because you want to create jobs, right? You want more union jobs. They love to say that here. We want more union jobs. They want lower prices. We should not want overpriced cans of Coca-Cola, just like we shouldn't want overpriced whatever drugs, that's the latest one, right? You don't want overpriced food or whatever. People have a right to these things, so we're going to give them for free. Or we're going to give them at a very low price. So what happens to these companies is that their costs increase and their revenues decrease. So all of them go broke. Every single company the Venezuelan regime took over went broke. Milk processing facilities, farms, manufacturing centers, ports, airports, the utilities, the banks, because they took over banks too. They took over even phone companies, telecommunications. They took over even small stores, like one of my best friend's grandmother's library. not a library, a bookstore that she had in downtown Caracas. The President Chavez literally walked by the street and said, expropriate it, not yours anymore. Why? Because it's a hate for the business owner, like every other socialist regime. So that was not enough, though. Not everything was taken over. And what was not taken over, the government came and said, I'm going to tell you how much you will charge for your product. You see, Venezuela, for example, had a thriving private busing system, like many developing countries, meaning there are these young, small entrepreneurs that own a small van of maybe like 10 to 12 seats, and they charge you to give you a ride in a predetermined route that they set up all collectively with other people. It's super interesting because this is all private, not government mandated. And the private busing works. The government came and said, you can only charge this much. Imagine if they regulated the price of Uber, right? There's a cap on how much you can charge for Uber rides. What do you think is going to happen if there's a cap on Uber rides? There are going to be fewer Uber drivers because they can't make as much money, or they can't make money, they won't do certain routes, like the market will change. Imagine they do that for rice, for milk, for eggs, for chicken, for chocolate. I'm going to say, price controls on chocolate. Why would they want to do a price control on chocolate? Well, because the people have a right to affordable chocolate, don't you know? You think it might be funny, but no, it did happen. My mom made chocolate bonbons. That was her side hustle. Like things for parties, birthdays, marriages, first communions, things like that. And she would make them in shape. She would even do the strawberries covered in chocolate, all that stuff. And like for weddings, she would dress up the strawberry chocolate as the groom and the bride with the different colors in white and black. It's really beautiful and delicious too. I was the taster, the official taster of the business. But because it was price regulated, you couldn't find the chocolate. So we had to buy the chocolate illegally in the black market, hide it in black bags, and then use it for the business. That's how it worked. Chocolate trafficking. And obviously that destroyed the economy. Nobody had an incentive to produce if you couldn't profit. So people stopped producing, and that's why we had shortages. That's why when you went to the grocery store, you were regulating how much you could take out. I would have to put my fingerprint, I'm not joking, a fingerprint scanner in the grocery store that they would use to verify your identity. This is worse than an airport. And then they tell you, what's your quota? Now, the rationing system changed. Sometimes it was the high-tech system like that one. Other times it was simply they would tell you which day of the week you are allowed to purchase things, in which case you would be really unlucky if your entire family got assigned the same day because you want to spread it out. You don't know when the food's going to arrive, so you have to game that system. You could trade days with others, like informally, and ask them to go, like take their ID, hope they don't see that you have the wrong ID. This is the system in which we lived in, because the government thought that people had a right to all these things. And the other way in which they tried to assure that was massive government spending that ended up being a deficit. Even the largest oil reserves in the planet were not enough to pay for free healthcare, free food, free electricity, free gasoline, free water, free gas heating, free, you name it. Bags of food that they would bring to your house. The government would decide, of course, what food you're allowed to get and you should get. And of course, if you complain in the neighborhood, they had a communal leader that then they would exclude you from the welfare because you were opposed to the government. Like my aunt, because she in a WhatsApp group insulted with a lot of very explicit words the communal leader. And I won't say what she said because this is recorded, but it was totally deserved. And so she stopped getting the bag of food. But this is how it worked. And even with all that oil money, they could not pay for all these things. So they printed the money to pay for it, and then we had inflation, and the poor became poorer, and the rich became poorer too, except the people in the government, of course. They became the new elite. We actually call them the plugged-in enchufados, because they're plugged into the government. Essentially, in fact, it's so stark, the inequality between the elite and the non-elite, that everybody who has a new car has to be working for the government. Has to be. There's no way you can purchase a car and you don't work for the regime in some. And I don't mean as a public employee, of course. They're screwed too. I'm talking about corrupt people who have deals with the regime. Those are the only people who can afford to live in Venezuela like a normal person. Normal too, right, in between quotes, because you would need still like an electricity plant at home because you will still suffer from blackouts even if you're connected to the regime. You will still lose your water at home if you're connected to the regime, so you need a water tank as well. And you need the gasoline, of course, to power your power plant, right? And so this is what destroyed our economy. Venezuela went from, in 1970, being the 10th freest economy in the world, according to the Fraser Institute, to in 2022, being in the 165th place. Of course, Cuba is not ranked, North Korea is not ranked, so they're probably worse. It's out of 166 countries that they ranked. But the point of this is, no country in human history has gone from top 10 in economic freedom to bottom 10 in economic freedom. No country has been as free and then become so unfree. Think about it. What are other examples of socialist states in the world? The Soviet Union. What was the Soviet Union before socialism? The Russian Empire, the poorest country in Europe, a terrible place to live, authoritarian as well. What was Korea before North Korea, at least the northern side? Ruled by the Japanese and the Chinese. It wasn't a great place to live. Cuba, perhaps, was the most similar, but they were still not top 10 in freedom, the Cubans. They were maybe average. Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe was ravaged by World War II before the Soviets, forced them into socialist regimes. So it wasn't a paradise, right? Even before World War II, it was not a paradise. So only Venezuela, you could say, wow, this was a pretty good country. And then it became terrible. And so how I want us to think about socialism is in the continuum I mentioned. Where on the one hand, you have socialism, meaning government ownership. In one extreme, you have total government ownership of everything, North Korea, where you don't own anything at all. A real totalitarian state. Near North Korea, we have places like Cuba, like Venezuela, like Sudan. You move away. Maybe in the middle, you have countries like India, a little more free, Spain, of course. And then in one extreme, you have like the most economically free places, Singapore, Switzerland for sure, freer than the United States economically. And with that, I mean lower taxes, more limited government, balanced budgets, stable currencies, very much free trade with the rest of the world. And you have Denmark, the United States, which are pretty similar. They're just different in different ways. Denmark is much freer than America economically in like trade, regulation, even if it's less free in terms of government size. And so that's how I want us to think about this. Yet you will hear many people that will tell you, Daniel, this is all wrong. The reason Venezuela is so poor is because of America, such as Representative Ilhan Omar of Minnesota, who says the policies that we, America, have put in place have devastated Venezuela. Or AOC, who says U.S. sanctions precipitated driving Venezuelans to the southern border. Interesting, Venezuelans flee to the country that is guilty of destroying us? I had never heard that one before. Same as Cubans, right? They flee to the United States because they hate, because America destroyed, of course, with the embargo. People generally don't flee to the countries that they think destroyed them. Now, maybe what these members of Congress argue is that Venezuelans are all ignorant. And we, don't recognize that all is the fault of the United States, right? So let's debunk all these arguments. There are three main arguments against blaming socialism for what happened to Venezuela. Number one is that, it's U.S. sanctions. So let's do this simply as a comparative exercise. Which other countries are sanctioned by the United States? Anybody can name some countries that are sanctioned by the United States? Russia. Okay. What sanctions are there with Russia? Really bad sanctions, actually. Same as Venezuela, like on oil, right? Very high tariffs. Financial sanctions. You can't use American credit card systems and things like that in Russia, for sure. Russia doesn't have insane hyperinflation or, has lost 80% of its GDP or seen 8 million Russians out of a much larger population escape. They only started escaping when they were scared of getting drafted, okay? Some of them, not even that many. What other countries? Yes? Cuba, okay. True. In Cuba, you can't even send remittances. They're limited, the amount of remittances you can send. It's, legally, you shouldn't really travel. You can't trade freely. That's not the case with Venezuela. You can go to Venezuela. I don't recommend that you may get kidnapped for being a U.S. citizen. But you can, at your own risk and your own dime. You can buy services from Venezuelans and goods, import them to the U.S., as long as they don't work for the government. That's not the case with Cuba. You can send as much money as you want to Venezuela. You can even send food, goods. There are companies based in America that send bags of items door to door in Venezuela that you pay from here. How do you think Venezuelans haven't finished starving to death, or why more people haven't fled? Because things are getting from outside. Venezuela, kind of like Cuba, became a parasitic economy to the rest of the world. You can hire Venezuelans remotely. I have. Me, Daniel. In fact, Venezuelans made my website remotely from Venezuela, my personal website, and I paid them. You can do that. So there's no legal sanction or anything. Now you say, Daniel, well, it's not the sanctions, it's simply that Venezuela is an oil-dependent country, right? And oil prices fell. It's the classic resource curse story, right? This isn't really logical because, if anything, having more natural resources should make you richer. And empirically, that's actually what happens. Empirically, which are the countries with the highest GDP per capita in the world? Anybody know? Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait. What do those countries have in common? They have a lot of oil, a lot of oil. Actually, not as much oil as Venezuela. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. But okay, Venezuela has a larger population. Okay, that should compensate each other. Now you might say, well, they didn't manage it well. They're not like the Norwegians or like the Qataris. They're just really worse at managing the resources. So it's not the oil prices fell, it's that they're corrupt, right? So you think the Qataris are not corrupt, right? You think the Qataris are not funding terrorist groups? Do you think the UAE is not corrupt, the monarchy? They're absolute monarchies. They don't even hold elections. Okay, they don't even pretend like the freaking socialists who all want to pretend to be Democrats. The Arabs at least are honest. Like, yeah, we're not democratic. We're a monarchy. We're an absolute monarchy. I respect that. Do you think they're not corrupt? Do you think Russia is not corrupt? Vladimir Putin is not a corrupt leader? Do you think Xi Jinping is not a corrupt leader? Do you think the Ayatollah of Iran, a country that is sanctioned by the US more than any country in the world, a country that is authoritarian and corrupt, in fact, more oppressive in social terms than Venezuela. I mean, women in Venezuela are not forced to wear hijabs. In Iran, they are. And a country that is dependent on oil, like Iran, why aren't the Iranians fleeing en masse? Go to Turkey. Go to Azerbaijan. They have bordering countries they could go to. Because they might be authoritarian, they might be corrupt, they might be sanctioned by the United States, but they are not socialist countries. You can own a business. You can start a company. You can get a job. You can feed your family. And that is what's driving people out of Venezuela. And that is caused by the socialist policies, not by democracy, not by corruption, not by sanctions, but by socialism. And many countries have tried this. Many countries have tried full-blown radical socialist systems. Very few remain. But what you will hear today in the United States is that, socialism is just what the Nordic countries do, right? Socialism is just a large welfare state. Now, you might want a large welfare state, but those countries do other things other than a large welfare state, right? Those countries have much more free trade than the US. Those countries might have a large welfare state, but they finance it through very different means of taxation than we finance our welfare state. You should read up this paper in the American Economic Review, which I think came out last year, which is titled, "Why is Europe More Equal Than the United States?" They find that the country, the developed country, OECD member, that has the most progressive tax and transfer system in the world is the United States. measured by the share of income that is distributed from the top 1% and top 10% of income earners to the bottom 50. The average tax rate on total tax rates, so I'm including sales, property, corporate, capital gains, income, on the income of the top 1% in Norway, in Sweden, in Denmark, in most European countries really, and the US is pretty similar. The difference is that the bottom half of the income earners in the US pay a much lower net tax rate than those in those other countries. So yes, they have all this redistribution paid for by the poor themselves. They also have this redistribution paid for by the poor while they balance their budget. They also have very little occupational licensing. They have lower taxes on their corporations than the United States. They have much more free trade. So have you heard ever in the United States a democratic socialist say, I want to balance the budget, I want to raise taxes on the poor, I want to liberalize trade and regulations, oh, and I want to lower the corporate tax rate? That doesn't sound like the platform of anybody who calls themselves a socialist. But that's what those countries do. And that's what they do to pay for everything else. So if that's what you defend, that's great. That's not socialism. I would actually trade some things for that system. Not all. I don't actually support that insanely large welfare state. I don't think we should have an insanely large welfare state paid for by the poor themselves. Otherwise, you're not doing redistribution at all. But we can talk about that. And you might say, Daniel, why do you care, right? Why do you care about this? This is not what's happening in America. We're not headed there. Well, I'll tell you several things. First, there are organizations like the Democratic Socialists of America that do believe in this. Organizations that Bernie Sanders belongs to, that AOC belongs to, that several other members of Congress belong to, that most of the city council members, for example, of New York City belong to, who meet with Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, the dictator, right? Well, they lie to you and say they just want some welfare. When the reality is that they want what socialism is, the dictatorship of the proletariat, where they are the proletariat and you are all the evil business owners, and you will all be oppressed and they will become rich. This is really what this is about. And you will see it every day. You might say, Daniel, what about the whole protest in the Palestinian stuff? You might say, and I'll tell you why this is connected. Remember the encampment at Colombia, right? Oh, this is all about Palestine and against Israel. Who was arrested at that encampment? Half of them were not students. And the organizer, who were agitators from outside, who were not students, was this man, Manolo de los Santos. Manolo runs this communist nonprofit in Manhattan called the People's Forum that agitates in favor of foreign socialist regimes. If you go there, I would encourage you to go, you'll find the flag of North Korea, the flag of China, photos of Mao Zedong, of Chavez, of Fidel Castro, and he's personal friends with the dictator of Cuba, and just went to Caracas to meet with the Venezuelan dictator to congratulate him on yet another fraudulent election for a 6-year term. But this is just about Palestine. So now let's play a game to finish. I'm going to show you a quote and 2 potential people who said it. You are going to try to tell me who actually said this, okay? Let's start with this one. The only way to save the planet is through socialism, but a socialism within a democracy. Who says it was Hugo Chavez, the dictator of Venezuela? Who says it was Bernie Sanders? It was Hugo Chavez. Sounded a lot like him, right? What about this one? Do you know who these people are? There's Vladimir Lenin and this former congressman now. Thankfully, he got primary, Jamal Bauman. Primary for anti-Semitism. Capitalism is slavery by another name. Who says it was Lenin? Who says it was Bauman, Jamal Bauman? It was Bauman. It was not Lenin. Okay, this one. The Cuban Revolution is a very profound and very deep revolution, providing their people with free healthcare, free education, and free housing. Who thinks it was Argentinian revolutionary leader Che Guevara? Who thinks it was Bernie Sanders? You're right, it was Bernie Sanders. Most people got this one right. Right, they just want to be like Norway, not like Cuba. I thought, well, they have free healthcare, all these free things. Isn't Cuba great? What about this one? The Cuban embargo is absurdly cruel, and like too many other US policies targeting Latin Americans, the cruelty is the point. Who thinks it was AOC? Who thinks it was Fidel Castro? It was AOC. Okay, second to last. We still have two more, including this one. There is a US-backed coup, and Trump is trying to install the far-right opposition. Who thinks it was Ilhan Omar? Who thinks it was Nicolas Maduro? It was Ilhan Omar, it was not Maduro. But Maduro thinks the same, don't worry. He probably told her to say that. What about this one, the last one? Politicians have cited free market principles and refused to intervene in markets on behalf of our workers. Who thinks it was Ilhan Omar? Who thinks it was Obama? It was Tucker Carlson. Who also doesn't believe in free enterprise, by the way, and it's a socialist light now. And we can talk about that. And so the reason I care about this is because these ideas have real-world consequences that are very dire. When I was a kid and I came here as a tourist visiting because, well, we kind of talk about the exchange rate regime and how like they essentially subsidize that we traveled abroad, and that's part of how they bankrupted the country. It's really complicated and fascinating, but we took advantage of that too. And so we came to Miami, and I went to Walmart with my parents, and I waited until everybody left the hall because I was ashamed that people would see me like posing with food for a picture. And then I asked my mom to snap a picture quickly before anybody saw me. And that's what I did. And it was to send it to my friends to show them. Now that's crazy, okay? You probably have never thought of doing that. But that is because we grew up in different places. And I think a lot of people in the US don't understand how blessed we are. And because you don't understand how blessed we are, you don't understand also how delicate this is and why this is. Why is there food in the grocery store? Why you have electricity or why you have water? It's not because there's a government mandate. It's because other people can profit from this, okay? And profit is not a bad thing. It's a good thing, okay? Stealing is a bad thing. But you giving money to somebody else for a service they provide to you voluntarily is a great thing. And that is why we are rich. And that is why you can even feed yourself. And that's why you're not a subsistence farmer or living in a refugee camp in some other country. So thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to your questions. So I have a mic. Is this working, or do I have to turn something on?
No, it's working.
Okay, so I'll pass it along. Who has a question? Okay, over there. Can you pass it that way? Try to not monopolize the time with the mic, right? Because I'm giving you the mic on your own hands.
I actually have two questions. One, why would you describe Tucker Carlson as a socialist light, as you said? Two, which would you say you're more concerned about in the current day? Democratic backsliding because of right-wing elections, or a slide towards socialism, state socialism, because of the radical left in this country?
Both great questions. Well, I think, Tucker does not believe in any of the tenets of the free enterprise system anymore, really, unlike in the past. You should watch this debate about whether we should allow self-driving cars between him and Ben Shapiro. It's really another proof of this, where he's like, oh, I would just ban them because I want to keep the jobs of these people. And it's like, well, you would have banned cars too because we want to keep the jobs of the horse riders. We destroyed the horse industry with the car, and I think that was a good thing. That's what creative destruction is about. That's why we don't smell feces in the ground every day with our transportation method, in addition to the speed and all these other things. So I just don't think he believes in anything. I think he believes in free trade, in a balanced budget, in low taxes, or no regulation. And, there's very little. He, in fact, has praised many times the economic agenda of Elizabeth Warren. So it's like somebody mentioned that it's like economically far left, but with different pronouns. That's essentially what Tucker kind of represents. And then on the second question, democratic backsliding that is, driven kind of like by right-wing parties versus radical socialism. I think it depends on the part of the world, right? I think certainly in Latin America, socialism is the big threat. There's no threat from really anything else but socialism in Latin America. And in part it's because it's funded by the Cubans, and that's their goal. In Africa too, really, and the same in probably most of the world. In America, I think it's really about just terrible economic policies that is bankrupting us, that everybody supports, which is like nobody's willing to cut entitlements and reform them. And we are headed towards a terrible fiscal cliff. And we're seeing it with inflation, we're seeing it with low growth, and we risk becoming like Europe, which is a low growth, stagnant society where the young have little opportunity. And that's really what concerns me the most. And that's what's going to create the political environment for somebody like Chavez to get elected in the future, right? And then when that happens, it's just too late. Yeah.
I have one follow-up.
Do you mind if I will absolutely, I want to answer, but I want to make sure if somebody else has a question. Who has a question? Yes.
I wanted to ask your thoughts.
Wait, use the mic because I think that they wanted to for the recording.
Well, first of all, thank you for being here today. I enjoyed the talk. I wanted to ask you what your thoughts are on the arguments of those such as Thomas Piketty, who will say that because of the outsized growth of asset prices relative to the larger economy, that an interventionist and redistributionist state is necessary. Just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Well, that his whole book is based on a false premise, and that even Stiglitz actually disagrees with Thomas Piketty because it's on a mathematical impossibility, which is that the rate of return on assets is higher than the rate of return on labor permanently. Like, it's just mathematically impossible. But and he made so many mistakes and so many intellectual dishonest tricks on his whole inequality analysis that I think that Gerald Otten and David Splinter have really corrected in their papers on using tax data on inequality in the US. There hasn't been that insane rise in inequality that they say. You should look this up. David Splinter and Gerald Otten. One of them, I don't remember if it's Gerald or David who works at the Treasury. Would you remember? Oh, both? And that's how they got access to like the good data. So I challenge their premises in the first place. And, and then the policies that they support, which I believe are based on those faulty premises, are terrible. What do they want, a wealth tax? It's like, what's the goal? Like, for the purpose of reducing inequality itself? Why is that a normative good? I mean, certainly good for all to become richer, but if you think that inequality is bad, you necessarily think that making people worse off can improve overall welfare, even if it doesn't improve the outcomes of everybody else, right? Because one thing is to say we need to have taxes to make the government function, and we want to support the poor to avoid extreme low outcomes, right? A different thing is to say I want to make the rich poorer because I am upset that they're so rich. Right? That's a totally different goal. And I think it's unethical, certainly unethical from the Catholic perspective, by the way. And you should read it since the new Pope, Pope Leo XIV, picked his name based on Leo XIII. You should read the reason why he did, which is the encyclical of Leo XIII, which is Rerum Novarum, in which he very much debunked this idea that we should make the rich poorer for making them poor's sake. Same as the other encyclical for any Catholics here too, or really Christians, or anybody interested in Catholic social teaching. There's another encyclical by Leo XIII called Quod Apostolici Muneris, which is just a fancy Latin name for on socialism, which is the official position of the Pope in that time, and that's really been adopted by the Church over the years, on socialist ideology. And you will read the most or the strongest letter opposing socialism ever written before it was ever implemented, by the way, because this is from the 1890s. This is before the Soviet Union. This is before any country really tried socialism. And they kind of predicted everything. It's really fascinating. And so yeah, I think that it's just unethical, terrible for the economy. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, here.
Yeah, I asked this in the lunch already, but I'm actually in Econ 39, and we read a lot about Paul Krugman, and he says that, Yeah, he says that, gains from trade, right? Gains from trade are not equally distributed, obviously. Some people are worse off. Workers from Tamaqua, Pennsylvania are worse off, right? And he suggests
From
that
where?
Tamaqua, Pennsylvania, workers, that's an example we gave in class. But my point is, I guess he makes the conclusion that redistributive policies to redistribute these gains from trade is preferable to like tariffs and these protective measures, right? And I think that that's a very convincing argument. What do you think about that?
I don't, and the reason is, for example, let's imagine this town that depended on a steel mill. So obviously, free trade in steel is bad for that town, but free trade in everything else is good for that town. So when you open the market overall, it's easy to say that that town would lose from free trade with steel with other countries in the U.S., right? And the rest of the country would win if that's the only town that produces steel. But once you do the entire system as a whole, it's not clear who is a net loser, who is a net winner, and by how much, right? And because it's not clear how much, it's not clear how much to redistribute. It's not clear who is eligible to redistribute. I'm not saying that in theory it's a bad idea to do this, right? The problem is that in practice, it's essentially impossible to implement, runs into a lot of political economy obstacles, runs into also disincentives, right? Because what happens if you say, well, all this town will lose their jobs, so we're just going to give you all universal basic income forever. Maybe they will not seek a job then, and then they will change their entire incentives. Like, there's so many complicated things from this, and that's why I don't think it's a practical idea. I think that the best idea is to simply have total free trade, and then try to have a tax and spending system that makes sure the poor can lift themselves up and it's not just insanely burdensome and complex like the one we have now. Yes. If you want to move it that way, sure.
Do you want to?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. My question was, with the rising disillusionment with capitalism, given the income inequalities, people are unhappy, there's externalities, everything. How do we stop people from being lured by the promise of socialism? Mainly because it's packaged in a lot of different ways. There's like different ideologies where people say, oh, we'll only nationalize banks or airlines. It's like selective socialism in a sense. How do we get people to not fall for that? I'm assuming they fell for that in Venezuela when they voted this party in.
Well, I think, on the selective socialism part, and I'll get to your question, but on the selective socialism part, many countries have government enterprises, and they're not pretty good in almost any case, right? I mean, think about USPS in the United States. It loses $1 billion a year that you're doing to subsidize cheap marketing that everybody hates getting their mail. That's essentially why we have USPS nowadays. It was an interesting idea at the founding, not anymore. And most countries have privatized their postal services. Italy tries nationalizing their state airline like every 5 years, and then it always goes bankrupt, and then they have to privatize it, and then they goes bankrupt again, and they nationalize it again. Alitalia, it's a whole mess. So like the government's role is not to own airlines, okay? That's not why we created governments, and they are terrible at running businesses. And then on how to stop people, I think one way is just all speculation, of course. I'm not an expert on like what's the politics of how we're going to stop it. But I would say we need to make people as rich as possible and show them that it's working, right? Why would you be lured to vote for someone who will cancel your student debt, right? If you have plenty of job opportunities and everybody's making good money. So you need to make sure people are not put into that thing in the first place. Why are people burdened with high student debt? Because the government is lining them in the first place that for bad majors, for programs that they don't even finish. That's why. But although, by the way, most student debt is owed by doctors and lawyers who are doing pretty well, okay? But the rest of it is owed, generally, the people who are burdened by it, by people who picked a bad major, didn't finish their program. And all that happened because the government nationalized the student loan sector. You know, if you had private loans only, I can assure you the interest rates would be different for different programs, for different majors, for different places, different schools, for different students, depending on their grades and the likelihood of finishing the program. And that would prevent this situation. So it's interesting how one government intervention leads to people demanding more government intervention. And an example where I'm seeing this work in reverse is what's happening in Argentina under Milei, right? Where they got tired of this massive government that was bankrupting them, and they finally voted for this very radical economist who tore everything apart within a year, balanced the budget within a month. You know, the new stat came out, the government spending as a share of GDP in Argentina declined by over 7 points in a year. I don't know of any case in the world where this has happened unless there's like some sort of like natural disaster or something that made the country poor, right? And inflation is falling and growth is increasing very fast. And so hopefully that shows a path forward. Yes.
You mentioned some of the like economic populist rhetoric that these leaders use to get in power, like promising better welfare states, etc. How do you think these leaders also utilize the more like cultural populist rhetoric, kind of similar to what's happening in Europe? And I guess, like, what do you think that interplay is between the more like cultural arguments and economic ones?
Yeah, well, I can tell you in Venezuela, you know, the socialist part was also very nationalist. You know, it was about like the foreign companies owned the oil sector and all these things. And it was also, but it was mostly just a class warfare argument. I think in America it's different because the left has also embraced the culture war in the sense of it's about whites versus blacks, it's about men versus women, it's about religious people versus non-religious people. It's like all the categories that you can come up with, they're using it to divide and conquer. And that's why we call it cultural Marxism, right? And so I think in America it's different because its history is different. In other countries, they use other strategies. Yeah, I mean, in Venezuela they tried, but that's not really what worked. What worked was just the class warfare. The rich are rich because the poor are poor. And in America they tried different things. So I do think there's a big connection. You know, they'll just use whatever they can to get to power. And that's just a strategy. Because it's not really about race or anything like that. Let's return to him.
So just to follow up on the Tucker Carlson one, and then I have actually another one as well. So would you characterize all and any intervention in the free market as a form of socialism? Because you call Tucker Carlson.
Tell me which, for example.
Well, I mean, you said like Tucker Carlson talking about how we should protect certain jobs because he doesn't want people to lose jobs. I mean,
certainly
that's
interventions like that to stop innovation, yes.
okay.
Not a form, yes.
Okay.
It's a step towards. Obviously, having that is not going to destroy you, just one of those things. But if you do it...
So any intervention is a form of socialism?
Not any intervention. Many government interventions are necessary, right? Like, for example, stopping fraud, or you need the government to have uniform sets of measures. You need taxes, right? Otherwise, how do you fund the government and the police and the military? And that's going to intervene in the market. You need taxation. You need many things. You need public services. And for that, that's the government intervention. So that's not all interventions. That's just certain really bad ones that he seems to support all.
Okay, second question. Theoretically, in a pure free market economy, all inequality that exists, would you say there's no empirical or normative bad inequality in a pure free market
I think
economy?
that unless you stole, it's not bad ever.
So if a market is left completely free, there's people who are
But
poor.
people who steal, you know.
Right, but people who are poor
crimes.
deserve to be poor in like a pure free market
It's a
economy.
normative statement. That's a different thing. What I'm saying is it's not unfair that people are rich in such a society. What I'm saying, but people are poor for many reasons that have nothing to do with whether they deserve that or not, right?
I mean, right, but a free market economy inevitably creates inequality and also inevitably creates poverty.
It's
So,
great inequality. Inequality is the natural state of human beings.
right, but any free market system manifests that.
And any system. There's no system in which people are equal, except the one where they're all equally extremely poor and starving. There is no other system. So we're only talking about whether it's desirable to have intervention to do a specific thing, right?
Yeah. Okay. So what?
We have two other questions.
Okay,
Here.
we'll do it, but then we'll go back.
Here.
Just to kind of bounce off of that
Okay.
question,
Yes.
what is your opinion on hyper-concentration of wealth within, ultra-rich, like billionaires? They create negative externalities for the entire society, including themselves. I'm curious
Which
to know,
ones? Which
like
negative
environmental
externalities?
consequences. Billionaires contribute 1,000,000 times more to carbon emissions than an average person does.
So you think that well, okay, so you're assuming a lot of things here. You're assuming that carbon emissions are bad and that's going to destroy us, and then therefore the rich are bad, and so we need to become poorer in order to save the environment, right? That means all of the United States, because overwhelmingly all of Americans are in the top 1% of income earners. So you probably would say that it's desirable to save the planet, we need to make all Americans poor. Is that a consequence is that a logic you would follow? No. Only a few people? It would have no impact on climate change, so the externality is meaningless. Because if we're only talking about Bill Gates, he has almost no impact. If anything, the richest person in America probably has done the most for the environment of any person in the planet, which is Elon Musk with his electric cars. So I would say he has a positive externality on the world. So I would challenge the whole set of assumptions.
Hi, thank you. Well, first of all, I read an article yesterday in the Financial Times which validates what she said, and I think it mentioned that the world's 1% contribute more to global warming than most of the world's poor. So there's evidence for that, I guess. But I also wanted to just bring up something you mentioned a few minutes ago, the example of USPS being subsidized by the government. What would you say to the argument that some outcomes might not be economical, but are also desired? For example, I think one of my econ classes recently, the professor said that the reason why the US railways still exist is because it's not because it's efficient, but it's because there's places where it needs to go, although they don't have the economic explanation to justify that, but still needs to go there. I would say the same thing for the mail.
US Airways, you said?
No, just the railway industries,
railways.
heavily subsidized by the government.
Yes. I'm also against that one, yeah.
Yeah, but also the mail, the justification is that there's someone living in the middle of nowhere in Vermont, but needs mail either ways, and the government has to subsidize that.
So what you're saying is we should subsidize it. We should pay for it.
Yeah, because
You
there's
think it's
outcomes
okay that
beyond
they force
economical.
other people? You think that it's okay for a mom that is poor in the Bronx to pay for the rural person in Vermont to have mail?
I don't think it's forcing. It's more of
It is forcing. It's
it's a
taxation.
social contract in the government
But it's
to
forced.
contribute to
It's
something.
forced because if she doesn't pay her taxes, she goes to prison.
Okay, I have a different question. Maybe you'll answer them together. Let me just finish.
By the way, I'm not against that. Like,
okay,
we need
yeah.
some force. We need some force in taxation, right? We need to fund some things. I am okay with forcing people to pay taxes to do a host of things. I'm just not okay for this specific thing and many others, because otherwise it's like, we should do the same. Like, people talk about mail as if mail was important nowadays. But what about forcing people to pay so that everybody has free food, right? The New York City mayoral candidate Zohran Mamdani says we should have government-run grocery stores. Are you against feeding the poor? We should have free food for everyone? Because if healthcare is a right, food should be a right, electricity should be a right, internet access should be a right, everything should be a right. Welcome to Venezuela. But no, because it's not the government's role, and people should work, and then, yes, like this should not be controversial. And yes, if there are some people who are extremely poor, there is first, by the way, private charity, plenty of it. The US is the most charitable country in the world. And second, we do have many government programs to protect the poor. In fact, too much, in a way. Trillions of dollars are spent, and they mostly don't go to poor people, they go to upper middle class seniors. Bill Gates gets Social Security and Medicare. Why should he? Like there's so many things. And their railways is the same. It's not because they want to give railway access to small communities. It's because the congressman from that state didn't allow the railway to be built in the efficient way to connect the cities, and he wanted to create a couple of jobs so people could vote for him in his small town that didn't need a railway. That's why we have all these Amtrak stops in inefficient places, and Amtrak loses money. This is how the political economy of these things actually work, and the congressmen lobby for it because they want jobs in their district. Why do you think military manufacturing is spread through every congressional district in the US? It is not because it's efficient and cheap and the best way for our national defense. It is because every member of Congress vetoes national defense bills unless they include jobs in their district. It is very inefficient. It's costing us billions of dollars in every single sector of the budget, including the military.
Yeah, just the last part. There's the main argument that people make for government intervention is that, well, first of all, I don't think that any one system is correct. I think a balance is always correct. It's almost a law of nature. One of the main arguments that has been made is that the government should have control or at least intervene a lot in the commanding heights. I think it's one of the
commanding heights?
There's something called the commanding heights, the main sectors of an economy, like the steel industry,
right.
Something like that.
This is very commonly made in developing countries, and that's why they remain not developing. They take over the main industries, the critical industries, right? Imagine in the US, the government came and said, what's the most critical industry in the United States? The tech sector. The US government is going to take over Google, Microsoft, Apple. How do you think that's going to work out? Government laptops for you all. Are we going to be better off or worse off? What do you seriously think? The US government, as it is today, with all its flaws and advantages, it's not going to work out very well. It's going to be disastrous. It's like probably the biggest disaster. Like if I wasn't going to be negatively affected, I would laugh at what's going to happen. But because it's going to be so disastrous, I don't laugh. Same thing with like what's going on with the tariffs now. Okay, but I want to return to him now. And then,
actually, we're out of time. So
oh, we are. Okay, but I'm happy to do any discussions.
Come on up and
yes.
questions you want to do so, but thank you very much for a very provocative.
Thank you. Thank you.